All right, so today we're really diving deep into traumatic brain injury, TBI, as it's more commonly known,
Yeah.
and specifically looking at it through the lens of, what it's like to be a caregiver for someone with a TBI.
And it's such an important perspective to consider
Oh, absolutely.
because
I mean,
caregivers play such a vital role in the recovery process.
and we've got some great material to help us unpack all of this. We've got this, uh, let me see, Caregiver's Guide to Behavioral Management of Traumatic Brain Injury, which seems incredibly thorough.
It's a fantastic resource, really comprehensive.
And then we've got something a little different to balance things out, a YouTube video titled The New Me, featuring a Dr. Dan Gardner.
Oh, I'm familiar with his work.
How are you?
He's great.
He seems like he has a real knack for, making these complex medical topics relatable and understandable.
He really does, yeah. He's got a way of explaining things that just clicks.
Exactly. So, full disclosure, we're not medical professionals ourselves, but
Neither am I.
okay, well, good to know we're all on the same page. But, we are intensely curious about this, and we've got your personal notes, too, to weave into all this. So let's just jump right in. The Caregiver's Guide, right off the bat, it defines TBI as a disruption in the normal function of the brain, which, okay, seems straightforward enough, but what does that actually look like in real life? What's going on in there?
Well, the brain, it's like this incredibly complex network, right? It's buzzing with activity, all these connections firing. And what happens with the TBI, even what we might think of as a minor one, is that it disrupts those connections, like a glitch in the system.
Mm.
And it's not just about the initial injury, it's about the ripple effect that disruption causes.
So it's not just about, like, how hard the impact was, but also where the brain was affected and how that impacts the way it functions.
Exactly. And that's why, you hear it all the time, no two TBI cases are the same. The guide actually goes into the different causes of TBI and how, depending on things like, let's say, the type of force involved, like a direct blow versus, I don't know, a rotational injury, which you see a lot in car accidents, the effects can be drastically different.
And that makes me think about something Dr. Gardner talks about in his video. He mentions a patient who had what was classified as a mild TBI, but their recovery was anything but straightforward.
Yeah, it can be surprising.
Yeah. And it really highlights how you can't always predict the long-term impact based on that initial, like, severity rating, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's not a one-size-fits-all process, TBI recovery. Even if someone's initial symptoms seem mild, there can be, lingering effects that impact their daily life, their personality, their relationships. And the guide even mentions how things like age and overall health can play a role. Like if someone's had multiple concussions in the past, they might be more susceptible to long-term effects.
It's like how some people, they get a cold and they bounce back in a day, and then other people are down for the count for a week. We all have different strengths and vulnerabilities.
That's a great way to put it.
So we've talked about the physical side of TBI, but what about the emotional and behavioral impact?
Yeah.
Because that seems like a whole other layer of complexity.
It really is a whole other layer. And, it can be one of the most challenging aspects of TBI for both, the individual and their loved ones.
For sure. And the Caregiver's Guide, it actually lists this whole range of potential changes, right? Like increased aggression or apathy, impulsivity, even just like difficulty picking up on social cues. It's a lot.
It's a lot to process, especially when you're also dealing with that, initial shock of the injury itself. And, Dr. Gardner, he brings up a really important point in his video. He talks about how these changes, they're not intentional. It's not like the person is choosing to act differently.
Right.
They're not personality flaws. They're a direct result of, the brain trying to heal and adapt after an injury.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But how does, like, a physical injury to the brain, how does that actually translate into these behavioral and emotional changes?
Yeah.
It's not as straightforward as, a broken leg where you put a cast on it and it heals.
Right, exactly. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the brain being this incredibly complex network. Imagine, certain pathways in that network are damaged or disrupted because of the injury.
Wow.
And, the guide, it talks about how damage to the frontal lobe, which is like kind of the brain's control center for decision-making and impulse control, that can lead to some of these changes.
So it's almost like if the brakes in your brain are damaged, it's harder to stop those impulsive behaviors or really regulate your emotions.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to think about it.
That damaged roads metaphor is really helpful for
Yeah.
visualizing it.
It is. And, those damaged pathways, they don't just affect, like impulsivity. It can also be things like emotional processing, memory, communication.
And that makes me think about, Guy touched on this briefly,
Yeah.
the idea of like someone's pre-injury personality and, their coping mechanisms, how those factor in.
It's such a crucial point. And it's something that Dr. Gardner, he also emphasizes this in his video. He actually tells this really compelling story about a patient who, before the TBI, was incredibly outgoing, social butterfly. But after their injury, they became really withdrawn, avoided social situations, even ones that they used to enjoy.
Wow. That must be incredibly isolating.
Yeah.
Not just for the person themselves, but also for their loved ones. It's like this, dealing with multiple layers of loss on top of everything else.
Exactly. And that's why, understanding that interplay, not just the physical injury, but also like who they were before, how they cope with things, and what kind of support system they have. That's all essential for, really effective caregiving. It's about tailoring your approach to, the individual, not just the injury.
So it's not just about addressing the physical symptoms, but also like providing that emotional support, helping them adapt to these changes that, they may be experiencing, which kind of leads us to like the more practical side of things. What can caregivers actually do to support their loved ones going through this? It feels like a lot, right? Like, where do you even begin? Because the Caregiver's Guide, it dives into all these practical strategies, which is fantastic, but it's also like, wow, how do you actually put this into practice?
It can feel overwhelming, for sure. But I think the guide does a really good job of breaking things down into, manageable steps. Like it really emphasizes these 3 core areas for caregivers to focus on, and those are communication, routine, and positive reinforcement.
Okay, yeah. Those seem like solid pillars to, build on. Could you maybe walk us through each one a bit more, like specifically in the context of TBI and how these areas are impacted?
Yeah, absolutely. So communication, it's kind of a given, but the guide really stresses patience here. And I know that seems obvious, but it's so crucial because, the person you're caring for, they might have trouble processing information as quickly as they used to, or, finding the right words, or even just understanding what you're saying. It's like, imagine trying to have a conversation while your brain is stuck in slow motion. It's frustrating for everybody involved, right?
Totally. And I can see how, even simple conversations could become really difficult and maybe even a source of tension if you don't go into it with like a really, really hefty dose of patience.
Exactly. And that's why the guide also talks about using clear and simple language, like avoiding jargon, avoiding big, complex sentences, and being mindful of, things like aphasia, which some people with TBI experience, which can make it hard to even get the words out.
So being really, really mindful of how you're communicating, maybe finding ways to connect that don't rely solely on words all the time.
Yes, exactly. Now, the second pillar, routine, this one really resonated with me because, TBI can make the world feel incredibly chaotic and unpredictable, right? And that can be so unsettling for someone. So the guide really emphasizes the importance of establishing consistent routines for things like waking up, meals, medications, even just, leisure activities, whatever it might be.
Just that predictability.
Yes.
It can make such a difference.
It creates a sense of stability, which can be so grounding, especially for someone with a brain injury.
It makes me think about, I was going through a really stressful period, I don't know, maybe a year ago, and just having that simple morning routine, like making the bed, having my cup of tea, quick workout, like it made a world of difference in how grounded I felt throughout the day, And that wasn't even dealing with a brain injury.
That's a great example. It's about creating those little, islands of predictability in what might feel like a very unpredictable sea, right? And for someone with a TBI, those routines can be even more crucial. So that's routine, the second pillar. And then we have positive reinforcement, which is all about shifting your focus. Instead of, focusing on what the person with TBI is doing wrong or what they're struggling with, it's about really honing in on what they're doing right, no matter how small it might seem.
Right.
Praising their efforts, acknowledging their successes, even if it's just these tiny little victories, it can make a world of difference.
So it's about really nurturing a sense of accomplishment, like encouraging them on this journey, because they're likely, facing challenges and setbacks along the way.
Right. Exactly. And it really ties into this idea that Dr. Gardner talks about a lot in his video about seeing the individual beyond the injury. He talks about how important it is to, encourage them to reconnect with the things they're passionate about, even if they have to adapt how they engage in those things. It's about remembering who they are.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
But how do you balance that encouragement with
Yeah.
the reality that, like, there might be these difficult behaviors to manage? Like we were talking about, the aggression, the impulsivity. Like, how do you hold space for all of that?
It's a delicate balance for sure. But the guide reminds us that, these behaviors, as challenging as they can be, they're often symptoms of the injury, right?
Okay.
It's not a personal attack, even if it feels that way sometimes.
Right.
So while it's important to, of course, set boundaries, make sure everyone's safe, it's also about responding with empathy and understanding.
Yeah, remembering that, the person they love is still in there, even if they're expressing themselves differently now. That takes an incredible amount of, like, patience and compassion.
Yeah.
And honestly, it makes me think about the caregiver themselves. It's like you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's why, self-care for the caregiver is not a luxury, it's a necessity.
Yeah.
They even dedicate a whole section to this because it's that important.
And it's often the first thing to go.
Right. Absolutely. It's so easy to get caught up in, providing care that you forget to take care of yourself. But the truth is, you can't be an effective caregiver if you're running on fumes. And that's why it's so crucial to seek support, whether it's from friends, family, support groups, therapists, whatever it looks like, Phil. Taking care of your own well-being, it's not selfish. It's the only way to provide truly sustainable and compassionate care to someone else.
That's such an important reminder.
It is.
This has been such an insightful conversation. I mean, a really incredible deep dive. And, we've just scratched the surface here. But I hope, for our listeners, this has given you a really good foundation for navigating the often really overwhelming world of TBI caregiving.
I hope so, too.
And remember, every single journey is unique. So never hesitate to ask questions, to keep learning and keep reaching out. You're not alone on this journey.